And welcome back. Established in 1983 as a result of the AIDS crisis, New York City's LGBTQ Community Center has grown and evolved over the last 4 decades, creating and delivering services empowering people to lead healthy as well as successful lives. Now, NYC's LGBT Community Center, Equality New York, and the New Pride Agenda recently announced their partnership and formally unveiling their collective policy and budgetary priorities to advance the LGBTQ equity and justice in New York State. We're pleased to have joining us the Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement at New York's LGBTQ Community Center, Trevon Mayers, and then also community organizer of the New Pride Agenda, Shéár Avory. And thank you so much for being with us as you both share in this conversation. So glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. And so there is this new partnership. And so for those of us who may not be so familiar with this new partnership, give us more about what this partnership actually means.
Thank you for saying that. I think that this is, it's definitely an opportunity for us to leverage the work that our organizations have been doing for a long time, but in a new way. I think that this is a partnership that really speaks to the momentum that that the LGBTQ community is leveraging now as we think about sort of like what are the unique challenges that LGBTQ are facing, not just in New York City, but across the state, and how we can usher in a new chapter to support folks that are actually experiencing and dealing with some of the challenges that have been exacerbated since the COVID-19 pandemic has taken place. And so each of our organizations, the center, you mentioned a little bit about the center's background at the top of the program, Equality New York and the New Pride Agenda, all have unique connections to community and all have different strengths. And we want to be able to coordinate and convene community in a way that we feel is most powerful and most beneficial to our end goal, which is to offer support for LGBTQ people across the state.
Yeah, share a little bit more for me on the issue of rights and really awareness, because there's some legislation that's out there that you're paying particularly close attention to that you want New York State lawmakers to really take into account.
Yeah, I think, again, thank you so much for having us. This is an incredible opportunity to share about our partnership and the legislative wins that we're hoping to achieve this year. It's really important that we begin to think about moving beyond a culture of protections towards a culture of equity. When we think about where the LGBTQ civil rights movement is today, we've made significant gains and significant progress, but there is a greater need to focus on those within our community who have been disproportionately left behind, who are still falling through the cracks. And so our legislative priorities for this legislative season really aims at addressing some fundamental concerns that are still lingering when we think about suicidality among young people, particularly with the anti-trans bills that are sweeping the nation and some of the most conservative states. It's really important that in New York, as a progressive champion, we really think about combating suicidality and supporting students. When we think about health and wellness, we have to think about how we can overhaul our education system to really be inclusive of diversity and of gender and of expression. And so we are aiming to pass the Comprehensive Sex Ed in Schools Act to really provide students with a wide source of resources and information to make informed decisions about their health and wellness. We also need to pass the Gender Identity Respect, Dignity and Safety Act to ensure that particularly trans people who are experiencing incarceration are safe and protected and are housed accordingly. We also need a TG&C Wellness and Equity Fund to invest in our communities, in the most marginalized communities that are often left behind in policymaking and budget making processes. When we think about the TG&C community, we are disproportionately on the margins across every sector when it comes to housing, employment, accessing public services. And so it's really important that we invest in communities, and the TG&C community in particular, to empower and ensure wellness.
I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that you're asking, hoping that will go through with legislation, which is the decriminalization of sex work. And for many people, that's a sticking point. Some people have their thoughts about that, but please, I would love to hear, and our viewers to share with us a little bit about what's behind the push for the decriminalization of sex work.
I'm happy to add in, and sure you can add in as you feel comfortable. I think the thinking behind this is really acknowledging that sex workers or folks that engage in sex work are disproportionately targets of things like harassment and abuse from law enforcement, while also still rarely receiving justice when harmed. Criminalizing sex work is something that often prevents folks that engage in sex work for survival to be able to access services that are critical, like healthcare and other health services. So the push is really to remove some of the policies that penalize sex work, because we know that vulnerable groups such as trans women of color, queer people, immigrants, who engage in this type of work for their livelihood deserve legal protections that reduce their exposure to violence and increase their safety.
Just to add on to what Trevon shared, it's really important that we acknowledge the ways in which sex workers are harmed and criminalized and policed. And when we think about sex workers, we have to center Black and Brown and immigrant, trans, and gender nonconforming sex workers in this conversation, who are disproportionately impacted by the stigma, by policing. And so decriminalizing sex work is really about improving quality of life, about offering opportunity for consensual sex work to enrich and empower the lives of trans women who are on the margins and who our society, to be quite frank, doesn't provide other opportunities. And so it's really about shifting the criminalization towards an aspect of really supporting trans people in their livelihood.
And when we talk about lawmakers, obviously there's sentiments on both sides of the aisle, pro and against. What has been the response that you've gotten from people as there is the possibility that these bills could take effect?
I will say that we've gotten a lot of positive feedback. I think that there's a lot of momentum that we've already sustained in the last few years since the center's advocacy work has been active since 2018. We've really cultivated a presence where we're able to partner with other statewide groups, talk to lawmakers that represent different districts across the state, and add the perspective of why it's important to think about LGBTQ people not as a monolith, but as folks that are in need and deserving of specific support and resources. And I think that we're in a unique place where we're thinking about how to navigate COVID-19. We're understanding how COVID-19 has exacerbated a lot of the longstanding challenges that we're facing in our community. And there's a lot of momentum to see this turn in a different direction. So when we talk about sort of like what the state and what our lawmakers are tasked with doing, it's really investing in some of the initiatives that are laid out on our platform, because this is particularly crucial at this time. at a time when folks are experiencing lots of new challenges and exacerbated challenges as they navigate COVID-19 for sure.
Yeah, sure. How do you grade the progress meter when it comes to dealing with issues affecting the LGBTQ community? Are we becoming more sensitive? Are we becoming more responsive, or is there a decline?
You know, I don't think that there's a decline in New York in particular. I think
Mhm.
across the country we are seeing um, we're seeing some really difficult conversations being had in communities. We're seeing a lot of fear come up as the nation moves towards a more progressive place as a cultural value, as a societal value. But I don't think that we're on the decline. I think that there is growing momentum and strong leadership across the board, particularly in today's young people. Young people have historically led social justice movements, from the civil rights movement to the Stonewall uprisings to March for Our Lives and Black Lives Matter. And so, no, I don't really think that we're on a decline, but measuring success, I think, is about accountability. It's about our legislative lawmakers being accountable to the communities that they serve and being responsive to the needs of communities in real time. And what the LGBTQ community needs right now is investment. We need investment, we need safety, we need protection. And so I think I'm going to be measuring the success based on whether or not the state legislature has an appetite to really respond to the calls of the LGBTQ community. We are united in our asks. This is a strong partnership, a statewide partnership with Equality New York, the Center, and New Pride Agenda. And so I really think it's going to be up to lawmakers to be responsive to our asks and accountable to the communities that they serve and what we're really asking for.
Yeah. Trevon, give me a little bit more about this conversation, because we have to have conversation in order to even get there. And sometimes having that conversation is number one, a hard one. And second of all, it's hard to even get one in some circles. Is the conversation beginning to improve in the area of being able to address this community that sometimes a lot of people have just, shunned a deaf ear to?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think that, like you said before, having a conversation is often difficult, but I think it's necessary. And I think within that, some of the things that we've been able to understand more closely is that a lot of the times our communities are fighting for a shared liberation, in the sense that the things that are impacting us, and as we think about LGBTQ people not as a monolith, are actually things that we've mentioned before: housing, education, access to resources, healthcare, affirming services and support. And I think that there's a lot to learn from engaging with folks that might be in other movement spaces, but the approach and sort of like what we're fighting for, and how our communities and how our approach is actually shared, I think is actually powerful. And I think that as we talk to more folks across the state, and we get a sense of unique challenges in other areas in New York State, it's been important to diversify the movement spaces that we have these conversations in. So not assuming that just being Black means that you don't care about LGBTQ issues, right? And like really highlighting how our community is intersectional, our concerns are shared, and activating folks along alongside our shared momentum for approaching these types of conversations.
Yeah, the conversations that we want to continue to have. And so I want to thank you for being with us. That's all the time we have for this one, but I'm definitely not opposed to us coming back and having it again. So thank you both, Shéár, Trevon, thank you for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll continue to monitor this and see, as things approach the state level, how it's received. So thank you both.
Thank you.
All righty. Taking a quick break here on the show, but we want you to stay with us. We've got more here on the Social Justice Forums when we return.